Thank you, Dan. Thanks for being here. So I've been doing games-related stuff for a long time. I've been at Ball State for about 20 years. And when Dan invited me, I thought a lot about what kind of stuff I wanted to talk about. And this will be a little broad-ranging. But I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I've had about making games over the last 20 years or so, and kind of the journey into how I got here. And I want to open with a really neat quotation that I came across recently, because you got to start with C.S. Lewis, right? So C.S. Lewis, in his essay on 3 ways of writing for children, said this: "When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up." So with that as my framework, I'll tell you, I play video games. When I first started at the university, that was quite countercultural, in fact, still. I remember I wrote a grant proposal to the NSF, and they said, video games are only good for teaching people how to kill other people. These days, I think we're a bit more enlightened about the idea that video games are part of society. It's an art form that is simply part of society. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right, because I look at my slides, not my notes. This is it. So video games are part of society. The Entertainment Software Association is like a lobby group for the video games industry, and they have these essential facts that they publish every year for, well, forever, as long as I've been reading them. So here's some interesting stats that are helpful to know. 65% of Americans play video games at least 1 hour per week. Okay, 65% of Americans. It is more minors than adults, but it's 62% of adults, right? So basically, you could say everybody plays video games, right? Majority, at least, plays video games at least 1 hour a week. And this includes everything from Wordle to Fortnite, right? Like, they're all video games. The video games industry is enormous. It's huge. You've probably heard it's larger than the movie industry. That's not exactly right, because it depends on how you measure it, but it's certainly true that the sales of video games exceeds the ticket sales of the entire movie industry. The gender divide is basically even. 53% male, 47% female. That's of the 65%. Right, so again, when I first started doing this work, there was a lot of incorrect assumptions about it being for boys. It never actually was, and certainly the data points that it is not male-dominated. 75% of players play at least 4 hours a week, average being 12.8, which tells you something if you understand statistics. What's interesting about this, too, though, is you should frame this in light of other things that people do. So according to Nielsen, this is 2023 data. According to Nielsen, in 2022, the average amount of time that an adult spent watching TV was 5 hours a day. 5 hours a day. That's TV, including streaming, including YouTube, including mobile devices and traditional television broadcast. 5 hours a day of programmed content. I'm not worried so much about people playing video games. I'm more worried about people watching TV, honestly. But we'll get more into that as we go. So one of the things people ask me all the time as a professor who studies games is, what is the best video game? And I'll tell you. It's this one. You're welcome. It's Every Extend. It was made by a developer called Omega, whose real name is Kanta Matsuhisa. It was released for free in 2004. And I'm going to show you it right now. Let's see if I can make this work. It's actually kind of hard to find these days. Yeah, that's good.
Paul, did we get your sound connected?
Well, I hope so.
You need to connect Bluetooth.
Oh, this was okay. It was coming out the TV speakers. That'll be fine.
Okay, it might come out the TV speakers.
Yeah. So this is the game. This was released for free by a developer who just really loves games and wanted to make something and give it away, right? As out of love, you could say, out of love for the art and out of love for humanity. It works like this. You choose a mode. You get a bomb that you control. Get a rockin' soundtrack. And you move around in this space. And you can see in the bottom right, my stock is 11. And if I press Z, I blow up. And now I have one less bomb. And so as I'm playing, I am losing the opportunity to play some more. But if I can set up a really nice chain and grab these bonus points, let's see, if we get these guys into position, here's a nice one. My stock is now 12, because I got enough points to be able to get more bombs. Now, the more you play, the more points you need to get more bombs. So the game always goes to an end. It only takes about 2.5 or 3 minutes to play if you're bad at it. If you're really good at it, you can play for about 4 minutes.
For how long?
4 minutes.
Oh.
And then you can play again, right? And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Let me get my settings back up here for extend. And, oh, look, that almost worked. Nice. We just need to tell this to slideshow itself. Oh, I lost my notes, though. I apologize. I don't usually do this approach. Give me just one moment. I will. Uh-oh. There it is. I'm going to just bring my presenter view, and this goes over here. And this does F11. There we go. OK. So that's every extend. Why do I tell you about this? Because in 2006, I was in my first summer here in Muncie as a professor at Ball State University in the computer science department. I had the opportunity to teach a seminar for grad students on game engine software architecture. So I was interested in, I've always been interested in games, right? I grew up playing video games and building little toy games and stuff. But I was interested in trying to explore this as a scholar, right? And to use it as an opportunity to teach my students. So I had 5 or so grad students, and we explored this domain, and I made this game, which is a clone of every extend. I called it EE Clone, because I wanted to see how I could use concepts from my field, design patterns. I mean, Paul Buis is the only person here who would know what that is. But I wanted to see how these things relate to game engine architecture. But what was important that summer wasn't this thing that I made. It was this thing that my friend Ben made. He was my student at the time, and now he's my friend. This was called the Bowl People Over with Boulders game. And the concept of this game is that you control a giant who has boulders, and you throw these boulders, and they bounce around and run people over. And it was fine, right? It was a good experiment in just figuring out how do you program these games, how do you build game engines. But there's a legend behind this that, depending on who you ask, the story comes out a little different. My version of the story is that I made this observation. Ben's version of the story is that he made the observation that they look like meatballs. And they do. So we took the game exactly as it was. We renamed it Meatballs Attack. Right? Now it's meatballs being bouncing around, right? We didn't change anything else except the title, and it made the game better. Now, as a scholar who's looking for good research questions, as an assistant professor trying to figure out how do I make my name in this field, right? Like, my eyes busted out of my head. I thought, well, that's incredible, right? We built a good sound software architecture as computer scientists or software engineers. We studied these design patterns on the inside. And this one little thing made the game definitely better. What just happened? So this opened up the door to me to trying to study games as such. Not games as software artifacts, right? But games as such. Games as games. So I started this exploration of, like, what have people said games are? And the first person that everybody points to is Johan Huizinga, a Dutch cultural anthropologist, who in 1938, cultural historian, 1938, he wrote this book called Homo Ludens. And he was interested in play. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Homo sapiens, right? This is man who thinks. It's a definition of mankind. It wasn't Marx. People say it was Marx. It wasn't. It was Benjamin Franklin defined man as homo faber, the tool-making man. He said what really defines us is that we make tools. And what Huizinga said is, no, it's play. It's play that makes us man. And his examples all came from examples of different cultures, exploring different cultures and seeing how playfulness, humans' desire and need for play, led to the emergence of culture. So his essential argument is this, that culture, religion, law, all come from the deeply human need for play. Now, this was 1938, and he was Dutch, and it might not surprise you, he was also racist. So reading his book is fascinating because not only does it show you the earliest published work on the study of play, but also how did people in 1938 even conceptualize what they were doing as anthropology or historians, right? It's a very interesting read. It's not so pertinent these days, but it is very interesting. Here's his definition of play. Play is free. It is not ordinary. It has location and duration, locality and duration, excuse me. It creates order, and it has no material interest. This is Huizinga's definition of play. Not game, notice, but of play. And it's pretty interesting, because it's actually out of this you get the magic circle. If any of you are hobbyist game designers, you've heard of the magic circle. That comes right out of Huizinga. Also, it points immediately to the idea that like a professional football player is not playing, right? He's working. A professional Fortnite player is not playing. They're working. That's working, because playing has no material interest, right? It's a neat idea. I like that a lot. So building on Huizinga's work, you get Roger Caillois, and I should apologize, I don't speak Dutch or French, so I might be mangling these pronunciations, I apologize. But in 1958 in French, and then translated into English in 61, Roger Caillois wrote this book, Man, Play, and Games. Now he was not an anthropologist, he was a sociologist. And his goal was to make a sociology of play that would describe society. So to describe society from the lens of play and games. This is also a really interesting book. I heard it described by my internet friend Chris Bateman as often cited, rarely read. His first chapter presents a fascinating taxonomy of play and games that game scholars everywhere cite. It's the rest of the book that adds a lot more value, but I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader. He says, Caillois' definition, play is free, it's separate from the routine of life, it is uncertain and unproductive. It's governed by rules that suspend ordinary laws and behaviors, and that must be followed by players, and involves make-believe that confirms for players the existence of imagined realities that may be set against real life. So this is like a richer exposition on the topic than Huizinga's, right? We're starting to see some really, really interesting ideas here about the relationship between the ordinary and the play. Now, what Caillois is most famous for is this taxonomy of 4 kinds of play. And again, this is a little bit of, it's academic jargon, but it's kind of fun. He says there's fundamentally 4 kinds of play. Agon is competition. This is person against person. So some play is agon. There's alia, which is chance. That's actually the Latin word for dice, which is the same word as knuckle. So alia is chance, right? Gambling, right, for example, or Dungeons and Dragons. Mimicry is copying things you've already seen. So again, things like tabletop role-playing games are rich with this, but any game with a story where you put yourself into a character, that's what he calls mimicry. And my favorite one is ilinx, which means vertigo, basically. And it's this sensation you get like if you spin around until you fall down. And young kids are really good at pretty much all of these, but especially ilinx. And ilinx is the one that people kind of grow out of because it gets more disorienting and like makes you feel bad. And I think that's also why you see like some people fall into trouble with drugs and alcohol, right? Is this desire for that sensation of the spinning around and falling down, right? It's according to this scholar, it's an essential part of play. All right, but let's take a little left turn here into some serious philosophy. Now, I've read those other 2 books. I have not made it through Philosophical Investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein. One of my favorite things about Wittgenstein is that in his career as an academic philosopher, he wrote a book and a book review. That would not get you tenure in the modern higher education system. And yet he is one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, which I think says more about higher education today than it does about 20th century philosophy. He is famous for coming up with this idea of language games. And roughly speaking, it's this idea that we can't really define any words. Rather, we engage in games with words with each other that if we are on the same wavelength, we communicate something with these words. But the words themselves can't really hold meaning. And in fact, he used the word game as his canonical example for a word that defies meaning. He says, for any definition you give of the word game, you'll find something that you think of as a game that's not in there, right? And vice versa. You'll think of something that you don't call a game that does fit in there. He points out just how elusive this is. And yet, even though he's probably right, it hasn't stopped scholars for the intervening 100 years or so to try to come up with definitions. So, for example, Bernard Suits wrote The Grasshopper in '78, and I haven't read this one either, but The Grasshopper opens with a retort against Wittgenstein saying, yes, we can define games, and he says we can define games this way. It's a voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Which is actually pretty darn good as a definition for game. Now remember, like, why am I doing all this, right? Because I'm fishing for where do I find purchase? Where do I find a root here so that I can start doing my own work? But Bernard Suits' definition is sort of nice. Oop, I have here. Yes, good. So it wasn't until 1984 that we get the first book about how to design games. Okay, so moving forward in history, we're in the 80s, right? We've had video games now for about 20 years, popularly about 10 years. And this guy, Chris Crawford, writes this book, The Art of Computer Game Design. I have a copy in my office. Chris Crawford is interested in how do we actually make these things. So we've had games since the dawn of civilization. But he's the first person to try to say, how do we make them? What does it mean to make them? What do we have to consider? And his book is highly technical because if you think about 1984, right, writing the simplest of computer programs was much harder than it is now. There wasn't as much tool support. So a lot of what he deals with is just practical issues of like, make a thing run on your hardware. Chris Crawford is also interesting because he was the cranky old man of game design before he was a cranky old man. He started the Game Developers Conference, which is next week or so. It's the annual get-together in San Francisco of game developers across the world. He was one of the guys that started it. And in, I forget the year, the 90s, I think, he left the industry. And that talk is called the Dragon Talk. And you can find it, somebody recorded it like on a handheld, and you can find it on YouTube. It's on my short list of the best presentations I've ever seen. So if you have an hour to kill and you want to see Chris Crawford leaving the games industry, look up the Dragon Talk on YouTube. It is absolutely worth it. It is brilliant, both in terms of form and content. So Chris says, Mr. Crawford says, games are closed formal systems. They involve interaction, they involve conflict, and they offer safety compared to what they represent. So deep in his vision for games is this idea that they always represent something else. Even abstract games always represent something else. Now, you can't talk about what are games without bringing up Sid Meier, right? So if you Googled famous definitions for games, you'll find Sid Meier, and people will say he said a game is a series of interesting decisions. It turns out he probably didn't. You can do a little bit more legwork and find that he said something like that at an unrecorded GDC talk 30 years ago, and he was talking about how do you make things fun. This wasn't his definition for games, this was his definition for how do you make fun games, interesting decisions. But I put him up there kind of because I'm a completionist, right? And if any of you are checking the game academic bingo, I've got Roger Carois, I got Huizinga, I got Sid Meier, okay, they're on there, good. All right. Second to last example is this one, 2003. Salen and Zimmerman, two scholars of games and practicing game designers, write a textbook on game design. Now this 84 is when Chris Crawford wrote the first book on designing games, right? So this textbook comes out in 2003 by Salen and Zimmerman, and their definition for game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. And I kind of hate it. But for many years, and it's probably still the case, like if you studied games in university, you'd probably read this book. I found it to be quite dry. I mean, no offense to Salen and Zimmerman, but I probably read it out of order. Because the best book on games is the one that I read that summer in 2006 for the first time. The best book about what games are is by Ralph Koster, and it's called A Theory of Fun for Game Design. This is Ralph Koster. It's an old picture of Ralph Koster. He says, games are exceptionally tasty patterns to eat up. What's he talking about? So Ralph Koster's book, which I highly recommend, A Theory of Fun for Game Design, get the second edition if you can. He's dealing with, the whole book in many ways is justifying to his grandfather why he hasn't wasted his life making games. That's really what the book is. He's trying to say, this whole thing is worthwhile, Grandpa, right? This is worthwhile. It's quite a moving book. And he won a Lifetime Achievement Award for this book when he was in his 40s, right? I felt kind of bad for him to get a Lifetime Achievement Award in your 40s. Yikes. But he points out that the brain operates by chunking data. This is how we know that the brain works. We know this from cognitive science, right? So what he's really saying here is that a game is reality pre-chunked by a game designer in a way that you can slurp it up without having to make those chunks yourself, which is brilliant, right? And he draws a clear connection to jazz, which I sympathize with. He says, if you don't study music, you might listen to jazz and say, what's happening? Like, this is awful, right? But musicians, a lot of musicians, most musicians, not all musicians, they love jazz because they find in it this playfulness, right? These themes and repetitions and motifs and good jazz, right? You'll find these things happen. He says it's the same kind of thing for games. You're taking a reality and you're chunking it into pieces that can be reused and expressed and shaped. Pretty cool. So A big part of a theory of fun for game design deals with games as learning opportunities. That because you're breaking down reality into these little chunks and people are slurping those chunks into their heads, that it is learning. Playing a game is learning the game. It's the same thing. And there is a learning outcome, which is that you've learned something about the game. So he says, fun from games arises out of mastery. It arises out of comprehension. It is the act of solving puzzles that makes games fun. So with games, learning is the drug. And he means that literally, right? Because your dopamine receptors, when you learn something new, fire, right? Your brain, like the normal operation of the brain is that when you learn something new, you get a little dopamine kick, right? It's a wonderful survival mechanism, right? You learn something about the world, dopamine, perfect, good. And people who don't have that, which is a real disorder, right, can't actually get rewards for learning. It's really kind of scary because it makes you realize that your brain relies on that. His stuff too, and again, this is academic bingo for games. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is famous for having written the book on flow, and he talks about everybody all together now on three. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote this famous book on flow, which I read recently and was a little disappointed with too, but I think, again, I read it out of order. I read too much about it before I read it. This is the idea that you want to be in this flow, let me just point over here, right? You want to be in this flow state, but if the challenge is too high for your skill, you get anxious. And if your skill is too high for the challenge, you get bored, right? So if you think about any kind of game you've played, or really any experience you've had where you get into this flow state, his argument is that there's these 9 or so characteristics of flow that happen when these two things are balanced. And a lot of Koster's theory builds on this. So it's kind of worth knowing if you want to understand some classical game design theory. But notice, you take a game like tic-tac-toe, and you can learn by playing it, right? But nobody plays tic-tac-toe for fun, right? I mean, a few people in the room may play tic-tac-toe for fun, but you reach a point in your cognitive development where it's not fun anymore because you've learned the game, you've mastered it, and you don't get dopamine for playing it. Like, you've already learned it, you've mastered it. And Koster addresses that specifically in his book. He points out that it's the destiny of every game to become boring. It's the destiny of every game to become boring, which, when you read that, it frees you up from these weird ideas that people might try to sell you on, like, you got to play the latest game even though it's just like the last game. I say, well, no, I'm bored with that because I've learned what the first-person shooter has to teach me already. More complex games, right, take longer to learn. It's harder to learn them. It takes more time. And to watch somebody who's really good at them is part of the joy, right? If you are a master at chess, part of your joy is watching other masters play because you can look for surprises. You've chunked those patterns, right? But there's a really important piece of this that I came across that really struck me early in my career with games. There's a famous paper by William Chase and Herbert Simon from 1973. So these are both scholars at MIT, I believe. Did I write it down? Carnegie Mellon, excuse me, Carnegie Mellon. And Herbert Simon won the Turing Award, which is like the Nobel Prize for computer scientists, right? So he's one of the greats. Here's the study they set up, all right? See if you can follow this, all right? They had a study where they set up a chessboard with pieces in a legal chess game configuration. And then they got 2 groups of participants, some of them who were good at chess and some of them who never played chess. And they asked them to memorize the locations of the pieces on the board. Okay? So when they tested how these people could recall the board, the people who were good at chess did much better. They were able to memorize the position of the things on the board and reproduce the board state. But in another experiment, they took a chessboard and they put the pieces out in an illegal arrangement, in an arrangement that cannot happen in the game of chess. Then they gave it to these same 2 other populations, right? People who were really good at chess, people who never played chess. And they found no difference in their ability to reproduce the board state. Okay? Got that? And when they asked them to explain, how did you do it? Or how did you fail to do it? They couldn't. Right? The chess masters could not explain how they were able to reproduce those board states. Similar to how consciousness is an emergent property, right, of the brain. The mind is an emergent property of the brain. The ability to reproduce those board states is not something that was accessible to the conscious minds of the people who were able to do it. That's fascinating and scary. Because we know that learning is a physical change in the brain, right? We know this from modern neuroscience, right? We didn't know this 40 years ago, but to learn something, your brain has physical changes that happen, right? And you can't access them, right? You can't like say, okay, neuron, right? It doesn't work that way, right? But we know that playing this game did something to the players. And they can't describe it and they can't explain it. But it did. Okay? So this board game, this is Pandemic by Matt Leacock, came out in 2008. Wonderful game. This is a board game, it's a cooperative board game. All of you play together, and in this game, either you save the world from a global pandemic, or everybody dies. So it's a pleasant little game, happy game. Like what?
Plague Inc.
I don't know that one real well. Is that a board game or a video game?
Video game. Plague Incorporated. Pretty much like the same idea that you have, but you use plagues to take over the world instead of armies.
Well, in this one, no one is taking over. It's the human players playing against the game. So it's a cooperative game where you're trying to save the world by matching cards, basically. So we know that playing games changes people's brains, right? But here's a really cool story. I had a student years ago who got a job at a software development company in Bloomington. And part of what was cool about this is it was a company in Bloomington that would not hire IU grads, but they did hire my Ball State grad, right? Because he was that good. Because he had done some really cool work with me, actually. He was a wonderful student. He was great. B student, by the way. Solid B student, but we did some great work. He had a great portfolio. He was easy to work with. He got a cool job. At his company, which made software for sort of like first responders, I think. When they interviewed people for customer-facing positions, so you're making software, but somebody's got to go and actually talk to users, right? They would have them play Pandemic during the interview. The reason is that you might say, oh, I'm really good at negotiation. I'm really good at teamwork. I'm really good at collaboration. But if you sit down and play Pandemic with somebody, you'll see, right? Are they good at these things or not? So the games don't just teach you things. They can also be assessments of what you already know. And a lot of the oldest games that we have are really about teaching or assessing survival skills, right? Can you throw the heavy thing? Can you hit the target? Can you get from point A to point B quickly, right? These are the oldest games that we have, throwing heavy objects. So take the great American pastime of baseball, right? What does baseball teach? Tell me, what does baseball teach?
Patience.
Teamwork.
Patience?
Teamwork.
Teamwork?
And coordination.
Coordination? Uh-huh.
Running, perhaps.
Running? Yeah,
Reaction
speed.
time.
Reaction times?
Survival.
So if you can duck fast enough when that fastball comes at you. Survival. Yep. Spatial reasoning? These may all be true. I've seen no data to support this. I've seen no studies that look at what does baseball actually teach anybody. But you see lots of people argue for these same things that you're arguing for. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying show me the data, right? Because I would argue baseball also teaches demonization of the enemy. Why? Because in the game of baseball, there is no opportunity to work together. You may not work together. They are the enemy. We are the protagonists. You are the antagonists. That's baseball. Because if it teaches teamwork, then it teaches this too, right? Like, it's not like a game can teach only virtue. And I'm being a bit provocative, right? I don't actually know what baseball teaches because nobody's done that research. So, go to grad school. Well, but if that happens for baseball, right, then it should happen for Civilization V too, right? The greatest of the civilization games, because it's the one that I fell into. Right? This is a game where you build up a civilization, you grow for years and years, and it's fine. But the funny thing about this is it was in 2010, so I was an active scholar, right? I'd been here for 5 years at that point, that James Paul G. wrote a famous book called, let me get the title right, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. So he was a literacy scholar, and he made this observation that his grandson or nephew or somebody had learned to read by playing video games. And he was blown away. He said, I can't believe it. There's all this good opportunity for, did you know you can learn stuff from video games? and the press ate it up, and the popular press ate it up, and the news media ate it up, and all of us on the inside said, like, Yeah, we know, right? We grew up playing Oregon Trail, right? but what was nice about it was James Paul G was able to open up the dialogue more. And again, there's that gap there that legitimized the academic study of games. And after that, you started to see things like more grant opportunities for scholars to be able to do this kind of work, because people were saying, oh, it's not just about making killing simulations, right? Maybe you can actually learn to read, for example. There it is. Okay, but why didn't this work then? This is electron field hockey, research project from many years ago. It was in Java before Swing, I think. Sorry, insider baseball. This was a game that was made to try to teach people about electron fields. So the idea was you would set these electric charges so you could drive a puck across a field of play, right? So you set your positive charges and your negative charges, and you're pushing a puck the same way that it would be moved by electric fields. Fine. What's fascinating to me about this is when you read the literature on it, you find some papers that say this was a success because people were able to complete the game and then pass the quiz about electric field behavior. Other scholars said this maybe wasn't a success because we saw no evidence that they could actually understand electric fields besides playing the game. Because it turns out learning to play the game is not the same as learning to understand the concept, right? This is that chess problem again. We know you learned something, but what actually was it? This gets into theory of affordances, which I don't think I'm going to go too deep into now. But here, let me give you a conception of it, right? Because to me, this is one of the most interesting things in the world. A scholar named Gibson did a series of studies looking at how we interact with the world. He's looking at infants and newborns, among other things. And he observed that we don't seem to see the properties of objects. We don't really see things as they are, right? Qualia. Our qualia, he would argue, that's not really what we see. What we see are affordances for action based on our relationship with the world and our desires at the time. So if my legs are tired, I see this and I see an opportunity to rest, right? Because of how high it is, because of where my knees are, and because I'm tired, I see here an opportunity for rest. But if I had to change a light bulb, I would see here an opportunity to raise myself up, right? So it's not like we see here sittingness, but if I want to sit, there's an opportunity in the world for this. So there's an interesting theory about games that works the same way, that says the affordances here, what this affords for us to do, to interact with it, is to play the game. And this doesn't work for the same reason that you don't go running around eating all the pills you can find after playing Pac-Man, right? It doesn't happen because Pac-Man doesn't, the affordances are different, right? The world of Pac-Man is not our world. The world of electron field hockey is not our world. So I hope what I've expressed here to you is how fascinating games are, but also the multiple conundra that come up when you try to actually make them with any kind of a purpose, because they're confounding, right? Not only do they deal with these problems of human perception and thinking, but the very act of playing them is this act of learning that we don't really understand, and we can't really predict what are all the outcomes going to be. So let me share with you a story from my own work that deals with this guy. You recognize him? Hoosiers? I'm a Yankee, so I don't have to. This is General John Hunt Morgan, Confederate general, Confederate brigadier general, who in 1863 engaged in what's called Morgan's Raid. It was the northernmost aggression by Confederates during the American Civil War. It was also, in some ways, one of the first recorded instances in America of terrorism, in that he and his men in uniform were attacking the means of warfare rather than other soldiers. It's pretty interesting. Not very nice, one might say. John Hunt Morgan didn't actually write any letters or books explaining why he did what he did. He was commanded not to cross the Ohio River, but he did anyway, into Mockport, Indiana, and then went through southeastern Indiana and through central Ohio. Was caught just outside of Pittsburgh, actually, but still in Ohio. So nobody knows quite why he did it. Now, I made a friend on campus, and he's one of my best friends now. His name is Ron Morris. He's a professor of history. And it was just a complete cold call. He emailed me once and said, can we get together and talk about games? I said, sure. So we worked together on a project to try to take this Morgan's Raid story and get it into a form that Indiana fourth graders could try to learn more about the historical raid, because it's part of the Indiana fourth grade curriculum. which is why anyone who is raised in the state should know this, right? Because it was in your curriculum, you must have mastered it. I'm from New York, where we learned a lot about New York history, and we also learned there are some other states. So this handsome fellow is George Ellsworth. He was called Lightning, George Lightning Ellsworth. And he got that nickname because he climbed a telephone pole. I don't know, he wasn't on a telephone pole, but he was on a telegraph line during a thunderstorm, trying to intercept messages for the Confederacy, right? So to do this during a thunderstorm, maybe not the best idea. But that's what he did. So Lightning Ellsworth, okay? So one of the things that Ron and I did when we were trying to make this video game was we started with what's called lo-fi prototyping or paper prototyping. So we had groups of students make what look like board games but are actually nascent video games to make these games, and then we took them to a local fourth graders and we had them play these games. So this is a particular prototype. This is southeastern Indiana. And this was a game where you moved your soldiers, or you only had one or two figures, across the board and had some card effects for special effects. Now, one of the effects was called Lightning Ellsworth. And when you played that card, you were able to take two pawns on the board and change their places. And the idea that my students had is that this would simulate Lightning Ellsworth's ability to intercept and then send counterintelligence, right, to mess with the messages of the Union. So they tried to show this idea in the game by having you, when you play the Ellsworth card, move the pieces from side to side. Now, what happened when the fourth graders played this game was they concluded he's a wizard, right? Like that is what they actually learned, is that Lightning Ellsworth had the ability to teleport soldiers, because that's what the game was. We said, wow, that's not how that works, but we learned a lot about like the dangers of making these games, right? Because it's a logical conclusion. The game we ended up making, we released, unfortunately it's not available any now because of technical obsolescence. This was 2011. I'm still really proud of the work. It looked like this. So you controlled all of the men in Morgan's group, signified by the guy on horseback here. And one of the main characters here was Basil, get his name right, Basil Duke, who was actually John Hunt Morgan's brother-in-law. And Basil Duke did write some letters and books about the raid afterwards, but whether or not he was honest, I mean, nobody really knows. It's part of the wonders of history. So in this game, you would choose what were your tactical targets at any time for your raid. And then at the end of the game, you would see how far you got as a player and where Morgan actually went, just in the southeastern Indiana portion of the raid. And I had a couple of students from the Honors College, and we did a qualitative analysis of what did players actually learn from this game. One of the things they learned was there was this guy named John Hunt Morgan, right? Which is good because there was, right? So that was a good learning outcome. One of the other things they learned was that regular people were involved in this raid. Now, in the game, and I apologize, I actually can't run it myself anymore either. In the game, when you raid a town, we faded the screen to black and played sounds of horses and shouting and gunshots. Right? So we didn't depict any violence, but it was certainly implied by the audio. And that was enough for these fourth graders, 10-year-olds, to understand, oh, like, there's people involved and they're getting hurt. And like, I feel kind of bad about that. And that's good. That was one of our objectives, actually, was to help them build empathy for common people who were victims of the raid. But one of the things we didn't expect was we used terminology that we liked because it was technically accurate and beautiful, like the chaos meter and the fact that you would get reputation. So in the game, reputation was supposed to imply that you had a positive reputation in the Confederacy and a negative reputation in the North, because that's what happened. But when we got this in front of these fourth graders, I remember one of them said, "What's chouse?" I said, well, okay, we failed there, right? That's not working. And to them, reputation was only bad. You could only have a bad reputation, and that meant you went to the principal's office, right? Because you were a kid with a bad reputation. The idea of positive reputation was just not in their language. So that was really interesting to us, because since then now, I've made sure that my teams and my students do a lot more playtesting with their target audience and test the terminology they're using, right? Because once you see this happen, you realize, boy, that the whole outcome of what somebody should learn from this might change based on that experience. Okay, you've listened to me for some amount of time. I think it's time to play a game. This game is called Buffalo. And can you see why it's called Buffalo? Because there's a bison on the box. Because in North America, there are no buffalo. There are no buffalo in North America. There are bison. There are American bison. I know this because I'm from Buffalo, New York, where you see buffaloes all over the place, but they're actually bisons. So anyway, the idea of the idea of this game, the name, is an uncommon verb form of buffalo, which means to sort of bowl somebody over with your argument, right? You buffalo somebody, which is where you get the sentence, buffalo, 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 which hopefully you've heard before, right? The buffalo that are buffaloed by buffalo, buffalo other buffaloes. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. Now, it wasn't actually my PhD advisor, but very close to my PhD advisor was a wonderful professor at University of Buffalo named Bill Rappaport, who's famous for making the 7-word version of that famous quotation, which is, if those buffalo are from Buffalo, then you get buffalo, 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 buffalo as a complete sentence. Okay, so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. You need to get into groups of between 5 and 7, let's say. I'm going to give you an envelope so you can form a group here, okay? So get yourselves into a group of some people. I'm going to be off camera here for a minute, so it might help to have a little table somewhere. Let me give one to Paul here. You can figure out where your boundaries are. Give one to Jess. Do you want to have a separate group here and join those people?
Right.
Yeah, give you one more. Okay.
We can join you if I can.
All right. Now, before you open the envelope, I'll explain to you the rules, but you can get your circles up.
Hey, are you guys in a group?
Well, no. I'm just combined in my life. They have it on.
Yeah, you could do 3 or 4. It's a little bit better with a few more people. It's pretty easy. And it's a short game, right? So you don't have to overthink it. Okay. All right, I'll explain to you how this game goes. Super easy. In your envelope, you'll find 2 decks of cards, an orange deck and a blue deck, which you'll set face down somewhere on a lap, on a table, something like that, okay? And the way this game works, and so before you do this yourselves, we'll just play through it here, right? Get a sense of it. You're going to flip over one of each card. So what I have here is songwriter, glasses wearing. And you want to be the first, what's that? Glasses wearing. Songwriter, glasses wearing. And you want to be the first person in your group to name a glasses wearing songwriter. Go. Levi. Good. That's 1. Levi here is a glasses wearing songwriter. So whoever said that, yeah. So my lovely wife would take both of these cards because she now has she won that round. Okay? Make sense? So then you do another round like this. Flip over another 2 cards. I've got fashionable rebel. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say you can't think of any fashionable rebels, okay? Just to understand how this goes. You kind of wait and you say, well, nobody can think of any. So you leave those up, face up on the table, and you flip over another pair of cards. I've got unhappy hacker. Now, you can make any pairing of at least 1 orange card and at least 1 blue card. And you get all of them you have. So I've got here fashionable, unhappy, rebel, and hacker. So if I could come up with a fashionable, unhappy hacker, I could take these 3 cards, right? If I could come up with a fashionable, unhappy hacker rebel, I could take all 4 cards. And if nobody can come up with anything, they flip over another pair of cards. Okay?
Could you do just 1 orange card and 1?
It's always got to be at least 1 orange and at least 1 blue. So you can't just do 2 oranges. It's got to be at least 1 orange and at least 1 blue. Okay? I gave you very small decks. There's only 5 of each. So give it a shot.
Yeah, it is. Well, let's see. I think just 5 for one. I can't remember.
Taking notes.
Yep. You burned it.
That's great. I heard him the hard way. Unattractive local person. Immature guitarist. Our son?
Yeah.
No, we don't make it.
I'm sorry. You don't know these people. Okay. Is it just speaking of French?
Pascal. That's Pascal. Local? No, unattractive. Oh. He's unattractive. He's right there's the black and white one up at the top there. Yeah, you get it. Okay.
Survivor?
All of them.
So I'm not sure. So they're double right? So it doesn't matter which direction it is. The vampires. That's a good
Logical ghost.
It's a good vampire. There you go.
Either Haiti is a ghost.
Casper.
I think Haiti was one that bothered about a ghost. You said Casper though. I think you gotta go Casper.
I don't know if I'm going to hurt that just because I'm sitting here.
Hades isn't a ghost though. Right?
Yeah, true. Hades is
We're
not
done.
a
That's
ghost.
it. Okay, so notorious.
Odysseus goes to the underworld. He meets Ajax, who doesn't speak to him.
Kelsey.
Sure. Dude, that works for me.
That's
You
true.
tell me if that's true.
Have you any of you read Mistborn?
He did have a scar.
Reading it right now.
Celebrity Muslim.
Animal? There you go. Exactly. They're pretty tame. Tanned Muppet. Oh, I thought it was tan. Okay, yes. Yeah, that is Bernie. I thought that could be
Right.
They need to do something nobody else knows. Like quote all sorts of random.
I say what about, but didn't I say Elon Musk? Yeah, he owns SpaceX. So does that mean
Does he actually like?
Alright, now you know.
Or we could just try to think some more about like, because we gotta figure out.
Quite stupid.
I'm gonna use word like this. I guess that's how technically. Yeah, that works.
Sure.
Alright, table.
I don't know. Like,
It's a table.
Okay, is everybody ready? All right. So, who's the winner in the room? Who got the most points? Who has the most cards? Anybody beat 2? Smaller groups will probably make it a bit easier. Oh, they're still going over there. Okay, yeah, all set at the back table there? Okay. So, there's a couple things I like about this game. One of the things I do with this when I teach my intro to game design class is I use this exact game as an example to teach a technique called MDA analysis. This was originally coined by Robin Hunicki. I've made a couple of changes to it, but it's one of these few things that came out of academic study of games that bled over into industrial game design. So this is something you'll find people use this terminology on both sides of that industry-academia divide. Here's the idea. The game designer can only specify what she calls mechanics. And that's actually, it goes the other way too. The designer can only specify the mechanics, and the mechanics are the only thing the designer can specify. So let's start with that. When you think of this game of Buffalo, what are some of the things the designer specified? And just to get you started, there are blue cards and orange cards. right? The designer made that choice. That was a design decision that the designer made. Well, what else do you see? What other decisions are manifest in this game that you would say a designer had to make that choice?
Make it both ways.
Yeah, having the text printed two ways. I don't know what you call that. It's probably a fancy word for that. But yeah, so that when you're sitting across the table, you can read it. Yeah, great. What else? What other decisions did the designer make?
Making the font a readable font that came up too.
Yeah, the specific font and the size of the font were intentionally chosen. Yep, there's no accidents in game design, right? These were choices by the designer. What else?
It uses words in English.
Yeah, English words, specific English words. At some point, somebody wrote these all down in a spreadsheet, probably, right? So they had to choose a language, some constraints, and then develop the actual words themselves. What else?
Cards are different than the orange cards. Like the words on them are different.
Yeah,
They're all adjectives and the
right.
nouns.
Yeah, I had to check my, yes, you're right. Orange are all adjectives, and the blues are all nouns. Yeah. Great, you guys, you got this perfectly, right? Anything else jump out at you?
Well, the bison was on it, or the buffalo.
Yeah, the use of the logo.
Two cards instead of 4, 2 colors instead of 4 colors.
Yeah, the fact you flip over one at a time from each deck, right? The pairwise is important. The mechanism for scoring relies on that too, right? This idea that you have to have one from each when you score is part of the rules of the game. Of course, all those rules had to be specified. Somebody else had a hand up over. Yeah.
I was just wondering if they did orange because there's some assonance, similarities between orange and adjective, and blue is a four-letter word and so is noun.
That could be. I always assumed it was because orange and blue are color opposites, that you get high color contrast.
There's that, that they assigned orange to be adjectives and blue to be nouns. I just wonder if, like,
that could be.
words themselves, like we see orange and we think, oh, that's probably more of an adjective. Possibly because our brain makes a connection between the sound of the words or
It
the
could be.
length of the word blue and noun. I don't know. Just fun to think about.
And bleeding that color on the front and back as well.
Yeah, when you start thinking about manufacturing, these are glossy cards. They're not linen finish. They have rounded corners, right? They're actually cord cards. You can tell by how thick they are. That means they have extra plastic on the inside to stop them from breaking down, which makes them not recyclable. Interesting stuff. So, the dynamics are what happens when you put the mechanics in play. So the designer only specifies the mechanics, right? That's the designer's job. It's what they do. When the game happens, you get what are called the dynamics. So what happens when you play this game? Like, what actually happens? How would you describe it? Yeah.
Well, you have people, all the players trying to think of different people. So I was thinking about this in the dynamics of this game. You need somebody with enough, like, you have to know enough people to be able to, someone with actual
Right.
control.
That's a beautiful example because the designers don't say you have to think of someone and you have to already know people so you can think of them, right? That's actually what happens when you say the rules are to name somebody, right? The rule is you name. The rule isn't you have to know somebody. The rule is you name somebody. But part of the dynamics is you've got to start thinking, right? Your brain starts spinning as soon as those cards flip up, right? What else did you notice about the dynamics of the game? Something the designer didn't specify, but that happens when it gets played. Yeah.
You get 2 cards and someone says something funny and everybody laughs.
Yes, there's a lot of comedy in the game, right? If cards come up and somebody says something funny, the rules don't say you got to laugh at jokes, right? But I see this every time I play. My favorite example was I was playing with a group of students and I had a very, very nice but very meek, quiet, introverted girl in the class. And a pair of cards comes up and it's Jewish lover. And she says, Jesus? It's like, that's the perfect answer, right? Like everybody burst out laughing because it was wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I actually sent that to the designers as an example, and they tweeted it out on their Twitter feed, back when it was Twitter. Good. What else? Any other dynamics you noticed? Yeah, Chris.
Because it comes to be the first person to say one that matches, so if one's like kind of a little bit off, it's like, okay, maybe we'll field another one that might be what we, so it might be what we choose, your answer, but then the other thing is the game could have been designed differently, where it's like, well, came up, it was, the Islam musician, right? Or celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got, yeah, so yeah, Muslim. And so it's like, okay, well, Cat Stevens. Well, so that would make, that's actually the perfect one, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, so had the game been designed a little bit differently where we each went along and went, we each named a person, and then we're like, oh, let me pick the favorite.
Picks the best, right.
Pick. So the game could have been designed differently, other than just being the first true match.
Right. So and that's great, right? So that idea is exactly what this MDA theory is about, is that the mechanics determine the dynamics, and a change in the mechanics will change the dynamics. So if you compare like apples to apples, where everybody tries to think of the best thing and you choose the best one, you get a very different dynamic than something where you're in a race to try to pick the first one. And you might say something that's like just absurd and bizarre because it's the first thing that came to mind, right? So great, you got it. So aesthetics, you probably guess, this is the feelings you have when you play the game. So this is not just like visual aesthetics, right? But the traditional Greek idea, like what are the feelings you have when you play this game? So what do you think? What are some of the feelings you had from the dynamics, right? The designer specified the mechanics. The dynamics are what you experience. The aesthetics are what you feel based on that. So what are some feelings you had playing the game?
Regret, because someone said something really good and you didn't.
Ah, yeah, sure. Some regret sometimes, yeah.
Anxiety.
That's what I felt.
I felt like social, like I didn't know if I wanted to say the things. I didn't know if it would be the best, and I didn't know if other people wanted to say a thing.
Yeah, and that leans into a little bit what Chris was saying about this like social negotiation that kind of happens when you play a game like this, right? There's an unspoken negotiation of timing and politeness and kind of testing the boundaries sometimes. Absolutely. The first time I played this, one of the feelings I had was embarrassment because Filipino came up as an adjective, and I thought, I can't name a Filipino like anything at all, but you know, I should be able to. So afterwards, I studied something about Filipino culture. But yeah, so some of it is good, right? Like enjoyment and excitement and laughter, but some of it can be critical too, and that's okay.
Some of them are negative too, like what was ours? Alcoholic, Hispanic, or something. Yeah. Like, oh, we should talk about that.
We had unattractive come up.
Unattractive local.
Oh, unattractive local person.
Oh man. Have a field day with that one. That's great.
Yeah, we won't tell you which one of you we chose.
So one of the interesting things about games as games, right, is that they have this property that the designer specifies something, then the players have to play, which the designer is not there for. And it's that produces the aesthetics. But the aesthetics are almost always the goal of the game design, right? A designer makes a game to evoke a certain feeling in a player. But in games, you are twice removed from that feeling. Unlike, say, music, where you might have a song and somebody hears the song, or you write a book and somebody reads the book. They have some interaction in that you have to like press play or something. But it's not like a game where you have this wild, uncontrolled dynamic space, right? Things can happen in play that the designer never accounts for, which again is part of the joys and the woes of the craft, to quote Frederick Brooks. So here's another interesting thing about Buffalo, okay? This game was designed by, at Tilt Factor Labs, which is actually a research lab at Dartmouth University, run by Mary Flanagan. And this was designed, Buffalo was designed as part of a research project to make interventions to help people reduce bias in STEM fields. So what they found was, when you played this game, I had to write it down here to make sure I get it right, playing the game statistically significantly increases social identity complexity, which predicts intergroup tolerance. So people who played the game actually learned better intergroup tolerance than people who didn't play the game. And this was tested weeks after play, right? They tested immediately after play and weeks after play and found these interesting differences on these as I understand it, well-normed instruments. And that's what the game was designed to do. One of the things that Mary Flanagan always talks about when she mentions this game is that if you hold up the cards, what's her example? Female scientist. Everybody says Marie Curie, right? It's a good answer, but it's like it's pat. But if you break that category and start thinking about other people in similar categories, glasses-wearing scientist, for example, right? It actually makes your brain change shape and change how it thinks about categories. And that's exactly what they wanted this game to do, was to make people think differently about categories. So it's a great success story from the educational games area. So I tell my students that game design, because of all this phenomena we talk about, that making games has serious social responsibility. And this kind of leads into some areas I've been exploring in more recent years. Because some of the stuff I've been doing for 10 years with my students. But I've been thinking more and more the last 5 years or so about, like, what does this all mean? So I found this wonderful quotation from Ray Bradbury. It's a little bit long. I'm going to read it to you, actually on paper here. So Ray Bradbury, in an unpublished interview, was asked, does literature have any social obligation? Here's what he said. Edgar Rice Burroughs never would have looked upon himself as a social mover and shaker with social obligations. But as it turns out, and I love to say it because it upsets everyone terribly, Burroughs is probably the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. By giving romance and adventure to a whole generation of boys, Burroughs caused them to go out and decide to become special. That's what we have to do for everyone. Give the gift of life with our books. Say to a girl or boy at age 10, hey, life is fun. Grow tall. I've talked to more biochemists and more astronomers and technologists in various fields who, when they were 10 years old, fell in love with John Carter and Tarzan and decided to become something romantic. Burroughs put us on the moon. It's nice, isn't it? Thanks, Ray Bradbury. I came across that quotation when I was reading a blog post by a guy who's kind of a hero of mine, truly. He's a very interesting fella. His name is Philip Frosek. Chris knows him, right? He's the face of Flutter, ex-Googler. He left a wonderful job at Google to be an independent game designer in the Czech Republic. And he wrote an essay called, We Need Technology That Is Less Immersive, Not More. And he introduced me to that Ray Bradbury quotation, and it was part of an essay where he wrote this. So Philippe, who's probably about my age, probably in his 40s, give or take, he said, I grew up in the 1990s, and while I romanticized space flight and advanced science as much as anybody else, my eyes went the widest from video games. Being able to immerse myself into a world that exists to entertain me was, surprise, surprise, preferable to doing almost anything else. So his essay is an exploration of this idea that maybe not the previous generation, some previous generations ago, they had the adventures of John Carter and Tarzan to inspire them to put us on the moon. My generation, we played video games all day. Because it turns out they're really fun. And they better be, because they're designed as little engines to generate fun for you. You don't need to worry about the rest of the world. You've got your video game. Well, maybe Philippe is right here. But let's go to the master, Tolkien. Right? His essay on fairy stories is the best thing you can read. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. If you haven't read it, you've got to read this essay. He talks about fairy stories. So what are fairy stories for? And his conclusion is that there's kind of four things. Fantasy is one. But the three kind of functional ones are recovery, escape, and consolation. His idea of recovery here is brilliant, and it resonates with what Ray Bradbury was saying about Burroughs and what Frosek was saying counter to games. His idea of recovery is that when you read about a centaur, now you can really see a horse. Right? When you read about a magical tree, now you can actually see the sycamore in the front yard. Right? That the fairy stories are your recovery from the normalcy that we imbue on the world by being familiar with it. But that recovery from fairy stories gives us that ability to see these things again. And I think that's what video games often miss. Right? They're designed to bring you joy, delight. They're designed to bring you delight. They're not designed to bring you recovery, generally speaking. Although, you should go wishlist Philip Frossek's giant robot game on Steam, because I think that's what he's working on too. I think we're brothers from different mothers and different continents. So. All right, let's get a little bit technical here. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because I'm not sure I can. But I want to talk about moral agency. And this is something I learned by reading two books. Chris Bateman's Virtuous Cyborg, which is good, and a wonderful essay by George Parkin Grant called Thinking About Technology. If you think about being here in pioneer days, here in Indiana as a pioneer, and you need an axe head, you got to get it from somewhere, right? So you find somebody who's selling an axe head who probably got it from a blacksmith, or you go right to the blacksmith. And the blacksmith has some, what are they called, blanks that he uses to make the axe heads? I think that's what they're called, right? Just the pieces of iron that he gets, or steel. And he gets them from somebody who brought them from the miners who dug them up. Now, each of those people involved in that process are embedding something about themselves into this process. But it was pretty simple 200 years ago. There weren't that many people involved. But if you think about going to Lowe's and buying an axe, think about the numbers of systems that are involved in that. From the paving of the roads to the shipping of the thing from China to the tax systems that are computed in real time when you go and swipe your credit card, right? Like, there are millions of people involved with your buying an axe at Lowe's. Millions of people who have a fingerprint somewhere in that process. And their purposes become embedded in the thing. This is something I see as a software developer, is that when myself or my teams or anybody makes software, the software is not neutral. The software contains our intentions. This is manifest in this old saying, right? Like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, that's because the hammer has moral agency. It reconfigures the moral space around it. Without the hammer, smashing things is not even on the table. With the hammer, it is. But this happens at every level of that hierarchy. So the intentions of the people involved are relevant. There are no neutral tools because of moral agency. That technology reconfigures the moral space around us. So I want to tell you about Heidi Beauvais. Beauvais, that's right. I got to meet Heidi Beauvais at a Meaningful Play conference 2 years ago, 2022, up in Michigan State University. She gave one of the invited keynote addresses. And she talked about how her group, her company, I don't know exactly what their legal status is, what they do is create media content in order to convince people of the truth of progressive political claims. So they do this by getting people to observe media content, doing eye tracking, tracking skin conductance, pulse, surveys before and after, interviews, so that they can make media that when you consume it makes you more amenable to accepting what you might call far left politics. You might say that's okay, or you might say that's not okay. That's not my point. My point is she's doing that. She has a TED talk about it, right? Like, you don't have to go to Michigan to an academic conference to hear her. There's millions of people who've watched her TED talk saying how what she is doing is creating media content as propaganda for a particular political position, right? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is what is actually happening. It makes Sweet Baby Inc. look like child's play, for those of you who are on top of this current games kerfuffle. Okay, so what is one to do? What is one to do faced with this? The best answer I've come up with so far, and I'm not saying it's the best answer, I'm saying that I'm still working on this, the cardinal virtues, it turns out. I think the ancient Greek wisdom here is actually pretty darn good. So here's what I got so far. We want to avoid problems that can come from playing video games, consuming media, which video games is just another form of media in some ways. Temperance makes sure that we don't spend inordinate time with these things. Fortitude gives us the courage to avoid immoral use. Justice ensures that everybody is given their due in the production and distribution of these products. Yes, I'm saying maybe you shouldn't pirate games. Prudence is where we use our intellect to power our decisions about these other three, right? Prudence is kind of the queen of the cardinal virtues. Now, the important thing, hopefully you all know, maybe you don't, right? Because we stopped teaching this in schools 100 years ago. Right? How do you get better at the cardinal virtues? Practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall, right? So I play video games, right? Sometimes I play them for too long. I try not to. I don't fall into that trap as much as I did before. But I see them, like watching movies, right, like listening to music, as something that should be subject to these cardinal virtues. And that gives me a little bit of hope in a world where there is so much overt propaganda. But we're here at the Alchemist Study Center. We've been talking too much for the last couple of slides about consuming media. Really what we should be worried about is the desire to cultivate redemptive culture makers rather than consumers, and doing so through truth, goodness, and beauty, right? I thought I'd get an amen there. I got it right anyway, so all right. So how do we do that, right? If we want to be on the side that says, I don't want to be spending all my time playing games. I don't want to be spending all my time watching TV. I want to be a culture maker, right? How do we do that with games? How do we make beautiful video games? Fortunately, we've got a wise guy here to help us out, Thomas Aquinas, right, who helped us understand what is beauty really? He says, integritas, consonantia, and claritas, but of course he's speaking in Latin, which isn't very helpful for me. Wholeness, proportionality, and radiance. Now, when Dan asked me to give this talk, I thought, man, the thing I really want to explore is Aquinas' theories of beauty and how they apply to video games. But I only had about a month, and there wasn't enough time for me to actually figure any of that out. This is what I'm trying to do next. This will be part 2, right? I want to understand this better. Where have we seen in video games wholeness, proportionality, and radiance? Let me give you some definitions that I found online that might be helpful to understand these. Wholeness means it must not be deficient in what it needs to be more itself. It's such a wonderful definition. It must not be deficient in what it needs to be more itself. Right? That's part of what makes every extend so good. It doesn't need more to be itself. It doesn't have more in it than it needs to have. It was made for love and to share with the public, right? It's beautiful. Yeah, and I just found this online, right? If you Googled, you probably find the same words. It must not be deficient in what it needs to be most itself. If you compare that to modern AAA video games that are just kitchen sink designs, right? Throw everything in it because somebody will like it. That is not wholeness. That is not beautiful. That is ugly. That's ugly design. Unintentional, ugly design determined by a marketing department. Proportionality is its dimensions should suitably correspond to other physical objects as well as to a metaphysical ideal. Oh man, what's the metaphysical ideal of video games? I'm working on it. I'm not sure, right? But it's in there somewhere. And radiance, I've heard people say, when Thomas Aquinas was talking about radiance, he meant literal radiance, like brightness, right? Like this light, brightness. Here's a definition I found online. Radiate intelligibility, the logic of its inner being, impressing this knowledge of itself on the mind of the perceiver. Every extend is unpretentious. There's no cutscenes, there's no microtransactions, there's no achievements, there's no roguelike mode, there's no new game plus, right? It tells you what it is, and it just is itself, and it's beautiful. So how do we make games like this? I don't know. I'll come back next year. But you know what we do have? G.K. Chesterton's advice for us. The man himself, who back in when he wrote, What's Wrong with the World over 100 years ago? If a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing badly. He was a champion of amateurs, right? He was very much against the professionalization of art. If video games are worth making, if board games are worth making, actually I really like board games too, I haven't talked much about them, then it's worth making them badly, right? Don't let anybody stop you. Just make one, right? If you want to write songs, do it badly, because you're going to have to do it badly before you can do it well. I tell my students at the university, every game designer has 100 bad game designs in them, and you can't get to the good ones until you get the bad ones out. That's just how it goes, right? This is art. But it's still worth doing. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. So how do you actually do it? Well, this is a fun picture I pulled up, which is 3 generations of Gestwicki gentlemen in a jam session. That's my dad playing the bass guitar, me at the piano, and then Peter and Daniel, I can't see quite so well there on their horns. My dad was visiting from New York, and we were jamming, right? So the idea is, it's a musician's idea, right? Everybody brings your axe, whatever you got, or whatever's around, and you just play. You just play around and see what comes out of it. And you get something odd and bespoke, and sometimes nice and sometimes crummy, but it doesn't matter because it's all about, doing it. It's all about doing it. So this idea has infused my last 10 years or so as a game designer and a professor and a researcher, that I've been doing more game jams. So just like a jam session is you bring what you got and you just give yourself a little time box, right? We're going to play some 12-bar blues for 5 minutes, away we go. A game jam is the same idea. Usually you have a timeline, like a time box, like 48 hours. You have a theme, and you just make a game, make a board game, make a card game. It's not going to be great. That's part of the joy of it, right? Everybody just makes a little thing that they can make. So I want to share some of those with you. I've been doing these myself. Oh, right, I need to switch this again to this other mode so I can get this to work. Where is my mouse? Here we go. So many years ago, I started doing more jams intentionally for me as a practitioner so that I could hone my skills, so I could have some chops when it came to making games in different styles, different art styles, different gameplay styles, different engines. And I brought my family along. So you remember the pandemic? Not the board game, right? But in March 2020, right, everybody was told you can't leave your house and we're not going to tell you for how long. So one day on a Saturday, I said to my family, we're going to make a video game today. And my advice is if you do this, talk to your wife about it first, because I did not talk to her about it first. I just said, this is what we're doing today. And we did. So in March of 2020, we made a fam jam game. So everybody in the family worked together to make this game called Joe Johnson Gets Captured. We had my son Daniel design the game. He was 4 at the time, right? This is 4 years ago. So my 4-year-old son, we said, whatever, was he 5? Whatever you want to make, we'll make it. And so this is what it looks like. This is Joe Johnson Gets Captured. And if you can figure out what's going on here, like you're doing pretty well. Oh, I'll try again. Okay, if you spam attack, things go pretty well. There we go. That's Joe Johnson in the pink dress. That's Joe Johnson Gets Captured. We're trying to start a new genre of games called Joe Johnson Gets Captured likes, At the time, my son Alex and I did the technical implementation on this. So I got to actually make it stop singing at me, if I can remember how. Here we are. No, I actually don't remember how. That's okay. Yeah,
Can I just say real quick, Paul, that it's
Yeah.
really obvious that you've raised your children with Homestar Runner?
Well, I mean, all reasonable parents have, as far as I can figure. Yeah, so Alex and I've been making games for a long time, but I wanted to learn a new engine. It's new to me. It's called Godot engine. Alex and I did one little mini tutorial once before this. We sat down and said, let's just make this game today. And we didn't really know how the thing worked, and we barely got this working. We finished at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And one of the things we realized is that is too late. Don't do that, right? Tighter time boxes. So from there, we the next month, and again, we're still kind of locked down. I don't know what's going on, right? We made our next game, which is the rocket and UFO game. So we went up one age level. Peter, my second son, he was, 7 or so at the time. He designed this game. And then we all worked together to make it, right? Everybody's contributing some art and some code and some music and some sound effects. But what I want to point out here is that this looks more like a video game in many ways. Of course, when you blow up the UFOs, they leave chickens in space, which you can collect. Oh, it's hard to get there. Yeah, so it's not going to win any awards. I need to turn faster. Come on, there we go. One more chicken. There we go. Right, it's not going to win any awards, but in the intervening month, we learned a little bit more about how the tool works. We talked more as a family about how we organize our days. We're going to start after breakfast, we're going to be done by dinner, right? And so that actually helped us quite a bit. And now, if you go on, we did this for a year, you get to what I think is really our magnum opus, which is Commander Quack Saves the Day. Come on, there we go. So Commander Quack starts with this little cutscene, right? Which is cool. There's a story. Here's the story. The aliens are taking over Mars. I must use my guns to stop them. That's the story. It's a timeless tale. And we got a nice, here we are, shoot 'em up game. Right, blast these guys, they fall down. Check out that background art that my wife made. Right, parallax background. There's 4 layers of parallax background scrolling here, all made in Inkscape. Well, and I died.
Who made the characters?
Who, I don't remember. Who, Daniel made the duck? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that duck was a late feature, but I love that death duck there.
My strategy is I just go from top to bottom shooting all the time.
So we made these games for a year. It was a lot of fun. I actually have a whole lecture on this you can find on YouTube about like why we did this and how we did it and like how your families could try this too. We took a little bit of time off. You can see there's kind of a gap here. But we started we finished the last year by making Clown Town. And again, I just want to contrast, like, yeah, I know, I trust myself. Contrast, we started with very simple, where is it? Oh, it's kind of small, I'm sorry. Can I full screen this? I don't think I can. So this is Clown Town. Whoop, I died. So I'm clowns and we're throwing pies out of our car to turn regular people into clowns. Because these clowns found out there are some people who are not clowns, and that's unacceptable. And I'm really proud of it. I think this is a really fun game. And we made this in almost a day. The original version didn't have that cool like fading in the horizon. Alex and I worked on it the next day because we were really interested in that. I showed this to my game pre-production students this semester, and I'm teaching that with a friend from the animation department. And immediately he said, if you had another day, you have to do, when the pie gets close to the pedestrian, slow down time, zoom in the camera, and get like a, and then they turn into a clown. Yes, that'd be brilliant. Okay. Good. So, partially I want to show off, right, because I'm proud of this work, right? But also, you could do this too, right? You don't need to know anything about programming to make a board game together, right? Take a rainy day, say, make a board game, you could just open the dictionary to a random page. There's actually game jam theme generators online that'll just give you random chaotic stuff. Try it. I mean, it's fun, and it's worth doing. So these are some of the things that I was thinking, like, what are the takeaways here? Like, what is all this? Well, games are important, right? They're important for society. They're also, like, prevalent, right? So we saw some numbers about that. Games are interesting because they're odd things to wrap your heads around, right? We know players learn things. We don't know exactly what they learn. We're not sure how to assess that. But things are happening, right? We do need beautiful games. That's one of my conclusions. We need that, right? And in fact, maybe the inverse of that is true. We need less ugly games, but we can't stop people from making those. So we have to overcome that by making beautiful games. And you can do it too, right? You certainly can. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. As I mentioned, I've got a blog here, actually, paulgestwicki.blogspot.com, where I put some essays about teaching, and sometimes I put up pictures of miniatures that I've painted, because I play board games and paint miniatures. I've got a YouTube channel with the occasional odds and ends of some programming tutorials, actually mostly game stuff, although I don't maintain that. I'm not a YouTuber. But you can check that out. And my professional website has some other links, like links to all the games I've made, in case that's interesting to you. You want to read more about any of these. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Yes?
What actually happened to your Morgan Leaders game?
It required a version of Java 1.8, for those of you who know what that means. Java 1.8 has security flaws that made a lot of organizations, including the university, ban it recently. Like, you cannot put Java 1.8 on university machines without special blessings from the IT people. And so it's impossible to get disseminated. It would have to be rebuilt in a new thing. And the engine that we built it with, the library we built it with, is not maintained anymore. So it would be, I've actually tried several times over the years to recreate it, but it was not worthwhile. The return on investment wasn't real good. in part because as a scholar, nobody cares if you remake something you did 10 years ago. It's hard to write papers about or present to anybody about. So, yeah.
Early on in talking about what is play,
Mhm.
a couple of the people said it's free. How do you interpret that?
Sorry, I missed the keyword there.
Free.
Free, yeah.
So how do you interpret what that means?
Yeah, free means like elective, like you have to choose to be part of it. There's a sense in which what I asked you to do now with that buffalo was not play, because I was kind of making you do it, right? If I bring a game into the classroom, I say to my students, you got to play this, they would say, well, that's not play now. That's some kind of work, because it's being compelled. Play, real play, is elective. You choose to do it, and not for compensation, but because it's your own choice. That's part of where this idea of the magic circle comes from, which is the idea that when you play a game with somebody, when you're really playing, the magic circle is around you, and that time is special and unreproducible. Like you can't ever have that again, and once you leave it, that it's gone, right? That's a moment in time that is almost sacred. There's some interesting, Ralph Koster, in fact, has written some about how that doesn't actually work. That's Heisinger's ideas of the magic circle. That doesn't seem to be what really happens. The magic circle actually seems to be leaky. There are things in the play that can leak out and affect other things. And in fact, a buddy of mine was telling me, I'll keep it anonymous, was telling me how he played a lot of social deduction games where you have to assume people are lying. And he realized that was affecting his ability to talk to people outside of the game, because he realized he was listening a lot to see if people were lying in just normal conversation. So like there are side effects to the magic circle. It's not strictly bound. We can see that in things like that software company using pandemic as a tool to interview people, right? That it's a little bit more than just a sacred time and space that is where nothing good or bad can happen, and it's like special. That's what Heisinger kind of described it that way. It doesn't seem to actually be that way.
That also wasn't free because they were compelled to do it, or if they wanted to pursue the job.
That's right. Yeah. You could say right. Yeah, you couldn't just say, no, I won't at this part of the interview. Yeah, it's very much compelled, yeah. But it's a neat example of games as assessment. I did some work 2009 or so on math assessment games. So I haven't seen a lot of data. I mean, this will get me in some trouble maybe. There's a lot of people selling products that they say, this game teaches you math. Some of those seem to work okay. Math games seem to work a lot better as assessments, and a lot of games seem to have this property that they're really good assessments of what you know. It's harder to see what does the game teach you, because you get into that weird baseball problem, like maybe it's teaching you teamwork, maybe it's teaching you demonization of the enemy. I mean, it'd be hard to measure, right? and it's very possible you won't measure the thing it actually taught you, because we know from that chess study that people don't know. We don't have access to that part of our minds to say, here's what I learned from that. Yeah.
So, along the same lines, with the fourth graders doing these games, or whoever, the idea of learning, and using a game for a pragmatic end, does that still qualify as elective? And in one sense, they are maybe choosing to play it and you're learning, but there's it seems to not be quite the same as escaping from or delighting in the magic circle idea.
Yeah. There's a couple of them talk about how like it's safe compared to what it represents. But if you're being made to play a game, there is nothing else it represents. It is it now. Right. That is the thing. And that's why in the biz we've got this term which is chocolate covered broccoli. Right? A lot of educational games are chocolate covered broccoli. Yeah. It's really not. It's just digital homework. Right? It's fancy homework. Now, homework is the kind of thing that probably should be made more fancy, right? And we can use tools like digital feedback mechanisms to make boring things a little bit more tolerable. I mean, there's an argument to be made there, but are you playing a game or are you just doing digital homework?
And does it make, it would be interesting if I don't know if you really said, but does it make the homework more attractive, or does it begin to make games feel like homework?
Yeah. Right. It's a little of both, I think, because one of the things I have to warn my students of sometimes is that if you really, really study games, you have a hard time enjoying them anymore, because you see through all the illusions. You see the tricks. And that's part of what I mentioned, that recent essay by Philip Prosek. That's one of the things he talked about a little bit too. Like, looking at games that I've played and enjoyed, I can tell you exactly how they were pulling me in and why they used those tricks. One of the things I didn't mention, I kind of went too quick through that part of the presentation maybe. I was going to mention along the lines of deceitful media, right? We know that intermittent variable rewards work. B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviorist, observed that intermittent variable rewards work great. So if you give somebody a machine where you can put in a quarter and you pull a lever, and sometimes it gives you nothing, but sometimes it gives you 5 quarters, that works, right? The brain is broken when it comes to that. Like, it will work every time. And when you look at modern video games, you see that everywhere. Intermittent variable rewards everywhere. If you look at any modern marketing, you see it everywhere. People talk about gamification. That's essentially what they're talking about. The other day, I bought a sandwich from Jimmy John's, and the receipt said, for this purchase, you get, I don't know, they don't get fries there. What was it? I don't know. Free jalapeno rings. I don't know what. Free chips. Try again next time to get a better reward. Like, so even on the receipt, they're using intermittent variable rewards to get you to keep coming to Jimmy John's. So yeah, that's an example, just one example of this trickery that's used in game design, that it's not exactly fulfilling the human spirit, right? It's simply leveraging the fact that the human brain will fall for this trick and you can get people again and again. It's your Netflix queue. It's the same thing, right? Netflix queue is exactly the same thing. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Ah, here's something good, right? It's exactly the same thing. Steam lists, Netflix queues, Facebook, Instagram, it's all the same phenomenon, right? Scroll, 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 bam, dopamine. Yes, I'm going to keep doing this, right? And I go, yes, there's the thing I want, right? It's a trick, it's a trap. And if you know it, you can call it out like a demon, right? Call it intermittent variable rewards, and then throw away your smartphone.
Or feed it to the pigs and watching.
Something, yes, maybe. Yeah.
I was a little confused by the idea that fun arises from mastery.
Yeah.
Is that mastery of the mechanics? Is that what he's trying to say?
Yeah, so Koster's point is that the thing that drives us to keep playing the game is that dopamine rush we get from learning a little bit. And that's why a good game will have like a scaffolding of a tutorial, a small world, a bigger challenge, and the boss is an exam. The boss is a test of your skills, right? And a lot of games have mini bosses, major boss. And that feels the best when it escalates that way. Now, Koster, sorry, I'll do a shallow dive on what's a deeper dive topic. There was in games the ludology and narratology wars of the 2000s. So scholars were lining up on both sides to say, games are systems, those are the ludologists. Games are stories, those are the narratologists. And the ludologists would say, well, your stories are just systems. And the narratologists would say, well, your systems are just stories. It went nowhere for a very long time. But something happened in 2010 or so that actually put an end to some of that fighting, besides just it like running out. That was the release of the smartphone. And all these people realized they could make more money making apps than fighting about which of these things is true. So there's still some formalists out there who are trying to like come up with formal language to describe what games really are, but a lot of that has died down since between 2000 and 2010. Sorry, what was your original question? Did I get to it?
I was thinking about more from a board game than video game.
Yeah, so sorry, to wrap that up, so some people accuse Koster of not taking story seriously enough, and saying, well, story is also something that drives people to play. His observation, and Koster is a writer. He's a game designer, but he's also a writer, a songwriter and a poetry writer. He is not afraid to say stories drive engagement, but he points out that in games, stories are feedback mechanisms. Stories are a tool a designer uses to tell you you're doing a good job, or to tell you you did a bad job. So you go through the adventure and you get the cutscene, and people say, oh, I play for the cutscenes. Well, maybe the cutscenes are there to keep you playing. Right? It's a reward for having played. So when he says the learning is the drug, that's what he's getting at, is that you've learned a system and you feel good, like, oh, I got a little piece of the story now, I got a little cutscene. Well, that's because you did the learning, right? This is your teacher giving you a gold star. Which is, and again, he's not absolutely universally true. He's not, people who criticize him, I think, have some good arguments. And this is the kind of thing that in my field, we'll fight about on Discord from time to time, right? Like this, that's how that goes. But you mentioned board games. I think it's the same kind of phenomenon, right? Like, you can play a board game, and my experience has been it gets more and more fun as you get to know the systems, right? And then you master the systems, and it's like, well, Dominion was fun. I don't want to play Dominion anymore because I've got it, right? I can play it, but I kind of got it. The only game that doesn't work for is Mage Knight, which is just plain good. So that's Mage Knight board game. Sorry, it's my favorite board game. It's really good. Mage Knight board game, yeah, by Vlaada Swaddle. So I can tell you more about it. So I tell you lots about it. Yeah, Marshall.
So I've got a question. So you mentioned the replayability of games is the dopamine rush and learning new things.
Mm-hmm.
So by that definition and by that logic, Fortnite is pretty much a good game in the fact of, oh yeah, there's always going to be more features added in later months. It updates pretty much every 2 weeks. It always has something new going on, which means more dopamine, more plays, more clicks.
Right.
But also meaning more people playing, because it's also free, so you don't need to actually use money for the actual game, unless of course you want to buy cosmetics.
Right.
There's always going to be new and better things. Like just recently, they just pretty much had their own rip-off of Guitar Hero, and also pretty much Minecraft, but Lego, and I think like almost like a racing game like Mario Kart, but without the power-ups.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but recent. Also, they updated every single thing, and everyone loves it. So I'm using your definition and that logic and applying that to the actual game as well. As you say, the reason why some games are better is because of the replayability and the learning aspect of the game.
Yeah, so these live service games like Fortnite are really interesting. And I read recently, I wish I could cite where I read this, but I'm not 100% I can remember. But they were pointing out that live service games, a better analytical lens for them is not video game, but social media, right? They're designed along the premises of engagement with a system. The individual rounds of Fortnite are games, right? But they're embedded in this live service experience that uses good I don't want to make it sound like these are all like ethical judgments, right? But like they are producing interesting, cool content, and they're releasing it to people, and they like it, and that's good. They can also use tricks like intermittent variable rewards, right? Like maybe you'll buy a loot box, right? Which I don't think are in Fortnite, but both of these things show up in live service games, right? You'll find a mix of what I would consider respectful design, that is designed for fans of the game for whom this is a hobby, and in their leisure time they're going to use this to relax, right? Which is important. It's good use of games. But a lot of live service games also are relying on tricks to make people think they want to be there, who in the absence of those tricks would probably say, this is not a good use of my time. And that's where I think those virtues come in, right? Because it's not cut and dry. It's not like you can hold up this game and say, this is good and this is bad. I think it's more about a relationship and an understanding of yourself and the game and the ecosystem. But yeah, live service games are a great thing to bring up because that is a big trend in the industry.
Yeah, which for a reason. Like I actually heard there's a live service Arkham game for Batman, which was I think like Suicide Squad kills Justice League. Where I think the beginning trailer they just show Harley Quinn shooting Batman in the head.
I forgot that was going to be a live service game. Yeah, that one kind of fell on its face, like a lot of recent AAA releases.
It doesn't look like a live service game.
Yeah.
It's more like a story-driven game than an actual live service.
There's an interesting thing here that people might want to know about generally. I'll keep this real brief. Between January 2023 and January 2024, there were 16,000 layoffs in the video games industry. So we're in the middle of an enormous, the beginnings of a trough, right? It's a periodic industry, right? Like a lot of entertainment industries. And this enormous number of layoffs has been really damaging. Some of it was probably avoidable, some of it was bad business practice. Some of it has been a weird number of very expensive games flopping recently because it turns out they haven't been very good. And
Call of Duty. They've been recently just pushing out like crossover after crossover and not really adding much to their actual game besides, oh look, you can play as Black Noir and Homelander from The Boys.
Sure.
Instead of like focusing on the patches and nerfs that they actually need because, oh look, there's like a bunch of gigabytes and megabytes they have to download, but there's nothing really added besides updates to the skins or something.
Right. Yeah. There's interesting. There's always interesting business and interesting politics in games.
It costs like $60 to $70 for the new Modern Warfare.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you have to pay more money for the actual skins themselves.
Right. Right.
Which,
So, I think Dan had a question here. Yeah.
An example, in my opinion, of bad business practice.
Yeah, some of it is bad design, some of it is bad business. It's a weird, and some of it is just market saturation. Sorry, one more piece of data. Last year on Steam, 13,000 games were released. So we talk about market saturation. 13,000 games released in just 1 year on just one platform. So like, there are business problems. Yeah.
You talked about with Tolkien's essay on
fairy stories, yeah.
Fairy stories, yeah. Which also, just a quick plug for Chesterton's chapter in Orthodoxy on the ethics of Elfland.
Yeah, that's good too.
Has
Yep.
some similar ideas. The idea of recovery is particular that overlaps in both of those essays. Like Chesterton says, why do rivers and fairy tales run with wine to remind us of one wild moment that in our world they run with water?
Yes, yes. I forgot that was in there. Yeah,
water is
wonderful.
magical, right?
Yep.
But you said that if I heard you right, that you don't feel like video games do a good job of that aspect of recovery, of helping us to appreciate the wonder in our own world. Why?
Right. I think many video games don't aspire to that in a way that brilliant writers like Chesterton and Tolkien could put their finger on and say, here's what this is for, right? Like they understood the concept of human flourishing and that their work could contribute to it. I know a lot of video game developers who are very proud of their work and think it's important and think it's valuable. But I haven't actually heard anybody refer to that idea, that by playing this game, I'm going to get better at life. Like my life is going to be better because of this. It doesn't come, I mean, I haven't been in every games conversation, right? But these are good people I know, right? Really, people who I really respect. But that doesn't come up so much. There was an interesting thing just on Facebook like today, right? Somebody at what was the big award show the other night? Academy Awards? Yeah, the Academy Awards. A guy won an Academy Award for Best Soundtrack. And he said into the microphone, I want to thank my mom and dad for getting me a drum kit rather than video games. Now, I understood that for him to be saying, I'm thanking my mom and dad for fueling my interest in music so that I could use this to make something productive and good with my time. A lot of my friends on Facebook, game developers, get real mad real fast. Like, how dare he denigrate our art form? I'm like, guys, he didn't denigrate your art form. He said, I'm grateful to my mom and dad, which is good. But there's kind of a defensiveness almost about it too, because I don't think there's enough people thinking about it from the culture-making, human flourishing point of view. I think we need more of that. I think there's some of it, but I think we need more of it. And I think a big part of it is that moral agency problem and the size of the pyramids, right? Hundreds of people, thousands of people involved in making a modern AAA game. And that it gets shallow, it gets mucky, it gets misdirected by bad business decisions. And the intention is not like, I want to help people understand that the valor they show in this game is a trait that they can have when they face true hardship outside of games. That conversation hasn't happened enough yet.
And I know Lily's got a question, but I have a quick follow-up. Then the game Special Ops Redline. Are you familiar with that one?
Oh, Spec Ops: The Line.
Is that the
Yes.
line? I'm not a video gamer
Right.
at all, but I have friends who have played it
Yes.
a lot, and I played along with a buddy of mine. I was fascinated because it's using Conrad's Heart of Darkness as a framework, and the guy has a voice, the voice of Kurtz in his ear, who is telling him what his next steps should be, what he should do, and who to shoot. It's a first person shooter.
Right.
So and then who to kill, and then as you keep going, the voice or the screen or whatever after a kill, it'll say something like, "Oh, did that feel good?" And then these odd kind of moral questions about, do you feel good about yourself for killing this person? And then as you go on, you realize this is an unreliable narrator,
Mhm.
and this is a recording that was, the guy's dead, Kurtz is dead, and this has been a recording, and you're listening to somebody just to, and so the directions you're getting have no, like they're not connected with actually the people you're shooting.
Mhm.
It's just, there's somebody there, and so you realize, well, I've just killed a bunch of innocent people. And the guys who made it said there are 3 options really with this game. You can either play it all the way to the end. You keep playing until you win it and get to the end. You can lose,
Mhm.
or you can just put it down and decide it's not a good thing to play. And they made it with this moral quandary kind of saying one of the legitimate options is to reject our game.
Mhm.
Which is, I thought, a fascinating piece on that moral question, and some of the people who are trying to they're trying to be thoughtful in that. I appreciated that
Sure.
whole idea of a thoughtful, ethical kind of situation. I don't know if you
Yeah,
understand that.
I have countercultural thoughts on that particular game, and I don't want to get myself in any trouble. I think they got real lucky with a low budget, and I think what they did was cheap. I think that's too easy to do, right?
Okay.
I can make a game where like you do something horrible and then say in the microphone, maybe you shouldn't have done that, turn the game off. Like, it's like, 4 minutes and 12 seconds of silence. Like, As an artist, I just don't care, right? Like, I want to see beauty. And a game where your designer lies to you, that's the easiest trick in the book to me. That's low-hanging fruit. So this is where I'm getting in real trouble. I don't like Undertale. Undertale is a game that everybody loves because it lies to you. I say, well, that's not beautiful. Like, a beautiful game doesn't have to lie to you. It can simply be itself. If it's truly beautiful, it can simply be itself, I would argue. And again, that's design philosophy. People can disagree with me. That's okay. But that was my read on Spec Ops: The Line, is that they ran out of money and they threw that in, and then people jumped on it and they got kind of lucky with the good press, and then did all kinds of interviews talking about how intentional it was. And more power to them, But as a designer, it's an easy trick, right? That's 12-bar blues, Yeah, Lily. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask, because you say like the reason we play games, like for the story, this is a way of rewarding us for playing the game. I've played the game Earthbound about 4 times.
Yeah,
I know the
classic.
complete story, I know everything,
Mhm.
but I'll still want to play it because it's like reading a good book over again. I know
Yeah.
everything, I'm not learning anything new,
Mm-hmm.
so then why do I play it again?
Yeah. I came across a good philosophy of that many years ago. I cannot dig it up now. But it was somebody, oh boy, I'll never think of it right now. But they were writing about these different reasons you play games. And one of these guys was arguing with Coster a little bit back when that was popular. And he was saying there's this regenerative aspect of games where you play an old game as a meditation. You play it because you don't have to think about it. In the same way you might read a book. Well, it's not exactly the same as reading a book, though. Rereading a book is beautiful. Who was it that said you haven't actually read a book unless you read it twice? Yeah, was that C.S. Lewis? Yeah. Video games, I think, tend to be more on the nose, right? I think there is a meditative quality to it, but I wouldn't liken it to rereading a book. Again, I could get in trouble for that too, right? But the design philosophy is a tricky thing. I'm currently, over the break, I didn't play any video games, but I'm halfway through reading Crime and Punishment. And I would recommend Crime and Punishment over any video game I've ever played ever. Right, because it's really good. And we don't have in video games, we don't have a Citizen Kane. We really don't. We have some pretty good games. We don't have a Citizen Kane. We don't have a Crime and Punishment. Some people have argued we can't. It's not in the nature of the medium to have that.
Well, it's a different experience, because I've had small arguments with people like, well, TV and books are exactly the same. Why does one have to be better than the other? They're just different forms of media. Like, well, you consume these different kinds of media differently. I think it's interesting to think that like we have great literature, we can't have great video games.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can't. I would say we probably don't. We have some good stuff, and there's pieces of things that are really good. Let me just give a quick example. And again, people can disagree with this, right? But if you know Undertale, then you know what I'm talking about when I say the game lies to you. And where I think the game fails is it doesn't lie enough. Once it lies, it says, look, I lied to you. I say, well, that's not good enough. Compare that to BioShock Infinite, where at the end of BioShock Infinite, they say, actually, this is just one game and there could be a million more because they always have, what is it, the girl and the father and the son. And then they show you, like, There's an infinite number of things. This could go on forever, and it'll always say the same thing. And in that was a subtext, and you'll keep buying it, right? Because it's the same story. This is the third game in a series. But they said, they didn't just say, here's a lie. They said, look, here's what's happening, right? We understand what we're doing, and you do too. And it's fine, because this is a cool story, and we could go on forever, which is very different than saying, I'm a designer and I lied to you.
Because I know that it's lying, but what are you talking about when you say that?
In Undertale? Well, this will be spoilers, right? Well, they tell you, yeah, they say, oh, you think you've been, I can't remember the acronyms now. You think you've been healing, but you've been killing, right? You thought HP stands for health points, but it stands for hurt points or something. It's something really juvenile.
Oh yeah, love is level of violence or something.
Yeah, LV is level of violence. Instead of love is level of violence, right? It's so juvenile. But it doesn't accept that if you can take an acronym and change it once, you can change it again. But that's what I'm saying Bioshock Infinite did really nicely. You say, if we can pull this trick on you, we can do it forever. Because that's the nature of tricks, right? If your game is about tricks, make it about tricks. The way that every extend is about blowing yourself up, right? Like, make it about that. My favorite example for this is Planescape Torment. This is a game from 1997 or so, right? So you probably haven't played this one, but it's worth it. Planescape Torment is a game about what changes the nature of a man. Has anybody played it by any chance? Chris? No? Yeah? The game is about what changes the nature of a man. That is the explicit theme of the game. It is the conclusion of the game. It's the beginning of the game, and it's the systems of the game. Everything in that game serves the purpose, what changes the nature of a man. Now, it's not a perfect game, but it does embrace that question throughout, which I think is wonderful, right? I think it's a triumph of being about something, right? That was a definition of wholeness, right? Right, wholeness. I feel like Planescape Torment is whole in a way that a lot of modern games fail to actually capture a theme because they're trying to just do live service stuff or kitchen sink stuff or whatever it is. Planescape Torment, though, eh? It's pretty good, right?
Please feel free to stick around. I want to be sensitive to those. We said 7 to 9, so.
Is it 9 already?
Yeah.
Oh, it sure is. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
But I also want to encourage anyone who wants to stick around and ask more questions to do so. I still have some for you also. But let's thank Paul.
Thank you all for coming. It was really a joy to share some of this stuff with you that I've been thinking about for 20 years or so.